Commander Yuki adjusted his four eyes to focus on the display screen showing the approaching Earth vessels. The ships looked like metal boxes held together with primitive welding and what appeared to be prayers. His scaled fingers tapped against the command console of the Harmony, a sleek vessel that could obliterate solar systems with a thought. "Sir, the human delegation is requesting permission to dock," announced Lieutenant Vexra, her tentacles dancing across holographic controls. "Their largest vessel is interesting. It appears to be constructed from several different ship types welded together." Yuki's mandibles clicked in what his species considered polite amusement. These humans had barely discovered faster than light travel, yet they dared to approach the Galactic Defense Coalition's most advanced flagship. Their courage was admirable, if foolish. The docking bay filled with strange sounds as the human shuttle landed with more noise than any civilized spacecraft should make. Steam hissed from overworked engines, and metal groaned under stress. Yuki watched through security feeds as the airlock cycled open with mechanical chunks and whirs that made his audio sensors wince. Captain Jin-Ho stepped out first, and Yuki immediately noticed something unsettling. The human moved with purpose, his eyes cataloging exit points and potential threats within seconds. His uniform was clean but showed wear patterns that suggested real use rather than ceremonial display. Most disturbing of all, he carried no visible weapons yet somehow radiated danger. "Commander Yuki," Jin-Ho said as the hologram flickered to life in the human ship's cramped communications bay. "Thank you for this opportunity. Earth stands ready to contribute to the coalition against the hegemony." Yuki's translator struggled with some of the human's words, particularly when Jin-Ho pronounced hegemony, with what sounded like personal hatred rather than professional concern. The coalition had fought the hegemony for decades using traditional tactics, fleet engagements, territorial disputes, and honorable surrender when outmatched. It was civilized warfare with rules both sides respected. "Captain Jin-Ho, your enthusiasm is noted," Yuki replied, his voice carrying the measured tones of centuries of diplomatic training. "However, we must be realistic about capabilities. Your vessels appear to be functional, but hardly suited for frontline combat. Perhaps supply runs or civilian evacuation duties would better serve." "Commander," Jin-Ho interrupted, something no species had done to Yuki in 3 decades of service. "We'd like our military advisors to speak with your tactical staff. They have experience that might prove valuable." Before Yuki could respond, the hologram expanded to show more of the human ship's interior. What he saw made his primary heart skip several beats. A man stepped forward with mechanical components replacing his left arm from the shoulder down. The prosthetic moved with fluid precision, and Tae-min's remaining organic hand bore scars that suggested familiarity with both giving and receiving violence. His eyes held the 1,000-yard stare that Yuki had only read about in historical texts describing ancient tribal conflicts. Next came Bo-Ram, a woman whose compact frame somehow commanded the space around her. She stood like a coiled spring, and Yuki noticed her gaze never stopped moving, constantly assessing threats and opportunities. Her hands rested casually near her equipment belt, but Yuki's tactical training recognized the positioning of someone, ready to draw weapons in milliseconds. The third human, Do-Hyun, appeared to be older than the others, with gray threading through his dark hair. He said nothing, merely nodded once to acknowledge Yuki's presence. Something about his stillness was more unnerving than the other's obvious alertness. He radiated the kind of calm that came from surviving situations that killed others. "These individuals represent our military advisory team," Jin-Ho explained, his tone shifting to something more formal. Tae-min specialized in urban warfare and close-quarters combat. Bo-Ram led reconnaissance operations in hostile territory. Do-Hyun coordinated long-range tactical operations. Yuki's species had evolved from herbivorous herd animals, and every instinct screamed danger when looking at these humans. They moved wrong, watched wrong, breathed wrong. Where galactic species had developed civilization through cooperation and mutual benefit, these beings felt like they had clawed their way up from something far more brutal. "Your planetary conflicts," Yuki said carefully, "were they recent?" "Some ended yesterday." Do-Hyun spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. Others are still ongoing. Earth has 47 active conflict zones, 12 ceasefire agreements that won't last the month, and 23 regions rebuilding from recent wars. The command bridge of the Harmony fell silent. In galactic civilization, wars were rare, formal affairs with clear objectives and civilized conclusions. The idea of ongoing, continuous conflict was alien to most species. We've been fighting each other for our entire recorded history, Boram added, her tone matter-of-fact. We've learned things about warfare that peaceful species never needed to know. Yuki realized he was looking at something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just warriors, but beings forged by endless conflict into something entirely different from civilized soldiers. These humans didn't just study warfare. They lived it, breathed it, survived it daily. The hologram flickered as Jinho leaned forward. Commander, with respect, assign us to whatever role you think appropriate. But when the hegemony shows up with their standard tactics and overwhelming force, remember that we volunteered for combat duty. As the transmission ended, Yuki stared at the empty display, wondering if the coalition had just gained powerful allies or unleashed something that would change galactic warfare forever. The first warning came as a ripple in space-time itself. Stars twisted and bent as massive shapes tore through the fabric of reality, emerging from hyperspace with the kind of precision that only came from 1,000 years of galactic conquest. General Kextar watched from the bridge of his command vessel as 37 hegemony dreadnoughts materialized in perfect formation. Each ship stretched over 2 kilometers long, their obsidian hulls bristling with energy cannons that could crack planets. The vessels moved with mechanical perfection, sliding into battle positions like pieces on a cosmic chessboard. Magnificent, whispered Commander Thelron, his insectoid eyes reflecting the light from enemy energy shields. Look at that formation discipline. Every ship exactly 12 kilometers apart, weapons charged to optimal levels, shields synchronized, for maximum coverage. The hegemony had conquered 47 star systems using these exact tactics. Overwhelming force, superior technology, and battlefield coordination that had never failed. Their ships were engineering marvels, each one capable of glassing the surface of entire worlds. General Kextar activated his fleet-wide communications, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had studied galactic warfare for 3 centuries. All vessels, assume defensive formation Omega-7. Heavy cruisers to the front support vessels behind our main line. We'll meet their advance with traditional tactics. In the cargo bay of the medical frigate Mercy's Wing, Sergeant Haye Jin looked up from the equipment she was organizing. Around her, other human veterans had gathered, their expressions ranging from confused to amused. They'd been assigned to guard the medical ships, the safest possible position in the coming battle. Did he just say traditional tactics? Asked Corporal Dongwu, his scarred hands automatically checking his gear out of habit. He'd survived urban warfare in 3 different Earth conflicts, places where tradition got you killed and adaptation kept you breathing. Haye Jin watched the tactical display showing both fleets positioning themselves like ancient sailing ships, preparing for a broadside exchange. The hegemony vessels formed perfect lines, their energy weapons charging with mathematical precision. The coalition fleet mirrored their movements, creating parallel battle lines that would engage in direct fire exchanges until one side's shields failed. Sir, Haye Jin addressed General Kextar through the communication system. Request permission to conduct reconnaissance of enemy positions. The general's reply crackled through speakers designed for polite galactic species, his tone carrying barely contained condescension. Reconnaissance, Sergeant. They're right there in formation. We can see them perfectly on our sensors. Every ship, every weapon, every energy signature is visible and accounted for. Dongwu shook his head, remembering insurgent fighters who had turned invisible in plain sight, blending with civilian populations and striking from positions that surveillance satellites couldn't detect. He thinks seeing the ships means knowing the enemy, he muttered. On another medical vessel, Specialist So Young was busy with what looked like random junk salvaged from ship maintenance areas. To untrained eyes, She appeared to be tinkering with broken equipment. In reality, she was assembling devices that would have made her old demolitions instructor proud. Earth had taught her that the best weapons were often the ones your enemy didn't recognize as dangerous. The hegemony fleet began its advance, each massive dreadnought moving at precisely the same speed, maintaining their perfect formation. Their energy shields created a light show visible across the solar system, overlapping fields of protective energy that had never been penetrated by conventional galactic weapons. Admiral Vorthak of the Hegemony reviewed his tactical display with satisfaction. The coalition forces were behaving exactly as predicted, forming the same defensive lines that 47 other species had used before their defeat. His combat computers had already calculated victory probabilities, casualty estimates, and the optimal surrender terms to offer the survivors. "Weapons range in 4 minutes," announced his tactical officer, a cybernetic creature whose brain had been optimized for combat calculations. "Enemy vessels are maintaining predictable defensive positions. No deviations from standard galactic doctrine detected." In the medical frigate, Jin Ho studied the enemy formation through a portable scanner, jury-rigged from ship components. His weathered face showed the kind of concentration that came from years of analyzing enemy positions for weaknesses others couldn't see. "Look at them," he said to the other veterans gathered around him. "Perfect spacing, optimal weapon overlap, synchronized shield frequencies." "It's beautiful. Beautiful and stupid," added Boram. Her compact frame bent over what appeared to be a maintenance console, but was actually a communications hub she'd assembled from spare parts. "They're broadcasting their position, formation, and tactical intentions to anyone with basic sensors." The human veterans watched as both fleets prepared for battle, according to rules that had governed galactic warfare for millennia. Energy weapons would exchange fire at maximum range. Shields would absorb damage until one side's defenses failed. Then the losing fleet would either retreat or surrender with honor intact. Du Hyun, the gray-haired veteran whose calm demeanor masked decades of tactical experience, observed the approaching enemy with professional interest. "They move like a parade formation," he noted. "Every ship exactly where doctrine says it should be, every captain following the same textbook." Taemin flexed his prosthetic arm, servos whirring softly as synthetic muscles responded to neural commands. He'd lost his original limb in a conflict where the enemy had also relied on superior technology and overwhelming force. "Technology didn't save my squad when insurgents started using tactics the computers couldn't predict," he said quietly. As the hegemony dreadnoughts closed to weapons range, their formation remained flawless. Not a single vessel deviated from its assigned position. Not one captain showed individual initiative or unpredictable behavior. They were magnificent, terrifying, and completely predictable. So Young finished assembling her improvised device, a creation that violated several galactic conventions on civilized warfare. "This is going to be easier than I thought," she muttered, checking the timer mechanism that would make the next few hours very interesting for everyone involved. The stage was set for a battle that would follow every rule of galactic warfare. What the hegemony didn't realize was that humans had never bothered learning those rules. The space battle began exactly as every galactic conflict had for the past 1,000 years. Massive energy beams lanced between opposing fleets, lighting up the darkness with spectacular displays of raw power. Coalition cruisers and hegemony dreadnoughts traded devastating volleys, while their shields sparked and flared under the assault. General Kextar watched from his command bridge as the familiar dance of civilized warfare played out on his tactical screens. Ships maneuvered in predictable patterns, weapons fired at maximum range, and casualties mounted according to mathematical formulas refined over centuries of galactic conflict. Then something strange happened. The human vessels, those primitive metal boxes that barely qualified as warships, simply vanished from the battlefield. "Sir, we've lost contact with the human fleet," reported Lieutenant Vexra, her tentacles dancing frantically across sensor controls. "They were positioned near the medical frigates, and now, nothing." "Retreated, most likely," Kextar grunted, unsurprised. "Probably realized this is real warfare, not whatever primitive conflicts they're used to." 300 kilometers below, The space battle, on the contested planet of Kepler 442b, the first hegemony landing craft descended through the atmosphere like falling stars. Each dropship carried 50 elite soldiers, cybernetically enhanced warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds using superior firepower and advanced tactics. The lead dropship's pilot, a creature called Vexmore whose brain had been replaced with combat algorithms, scanned the landing zone through multiple sensor arrays. No enemy presence detected. No energy signatures, no conventional weapons, no defensive positions. This will be a simple occupation. The massive craft touched down with mechanical precision, its landing thrusters scorching the alien grass beneath. The rear ramp lowered. With a hydraulic hiss, and armored soldiers began filing out in perfect formation. Vexmore took exactly 3 steps before the ground exploded beneath him. The improvised explosive device had been constructed from a ship's power coupling, some spare wiring, and a timing mechanism salvaged from a food processor. Taman had spent 2 days teaching coalition engineers how to turn everyday equipment into deadly surprises, sharing knowledge earned in urban conflicts, where insurgents turned city blocks into killing fields. "Beautiful work," Taman whispered, from his concealed position 2 kilometers away, watching through improvised optics as the second landing craft cautiously approached the smoking crater where its predecessor had been. The hegemony soldiers were scanning for conventional threats, energy weapons, military vehicles, anything their computers recognized as dangerous. They never thought to look for humans buried in shallow holes, covered with local vegetation, armed, with nothing but patience and creativity. The second dropship landed 50 meters from the first crater, its pilot convinced this was a safer position. The hegemony soldiers deployed in textbook formation, weapons raised, sensors sweeping for enemies that should have been visible on their advanced detection systems. Instead, they found a landscape that seemed empty, but felt wrong. Trees that looked normal but had been carefully arranged to channel movement. Rocks that appeared natural but blocked escape routes. Ground that seemed solid but concealed networks of tunnels dug by humans who understood how to disappear into terrain. Meanwhile, 800 kilometers away, Boram was demonstrating why water was humanity's secret weapon. The hegemony had established what they considered an impregnable forward base on a large island, surrounded by an ocean they assumed was impassable. Their security systems monitored the air for flying vehicles, the surface for approaching boats, and the shoreline for amphibious assaults. None of them thought to watch underwater. Boram led a team of 6 humans and 12 coalition volunteers through the planet's ocean system, using breathing apparatus jury-rigged from ship life support systems. They moved like sea creatures, following underwater terrain that hegemony computers had never bothered to map. Their weapons were simple: knives, wire, small explosive charges. Nothing that would register on energy scanners designed to detect advanced galactic weaponry. They surfaced inside the base's water treatment facility, a location the hegemony considered completely secure. The facility's automated systems recognized them as maintenance personnel, because the base's computers couldn't imagine that enemies would infiltrate through the drinking water supply. 20 minutes later, the base's primary communications array went silent. Then the power grid failed. Then the air recycling system stopped working. One by one, critical systems suffered mysterious failures that left the hegemony garrison isolated, blind, and slowly suffocating. The base commander, General Zarkoth, frantically tried to contact his orbital support. "We're under attack, but we can't identify the enemy. Our sensors show no hostile forces, no energy weapons, no conventional threats. Yet somehow we're losing control of our own base." 3,000 kilometers to the north, Do-hyun was proving that impossible positions were only impossible if you thought like a conventional soldier. He had established sniper positions in locations that violated every principle of galactic warfare, places where exposure to radiation should have been lethal, where atmospheric pressure should have been crushing, where the terrain offered no logical cover or escape routes. But Do-hyun had learned warfare in conflicts where logic was a luxury, and survival meant adapting to environments that wanted to kill you. He used improvised breathing gear, makeshift radiation shielding, and positioning that relied on understanding weather patterns rather than tactical doctrine. from his perch inside a collapsed building that hegemony sensors registered as structurally unsound and therefore unoccupied. Du Hyun watched enemy officers through optics assembled from ship navigation equipment. His weapon was equally improvised, a railgun constructed from magnetic coils salvaged from a cargo lifter, firing projectiles machined from asteroid metal. The first shot removed a hegemony field commander from existence. The projectile traveled so fast that it vaporized on impact, leaving no trace of conventional weaponry for investigators to analyze. To enemy observers, their leader had simply exploded without warning or apparent cause. The second shot took out a communications specialist. The third eliminated a tactical coordinator. Each kill was surgical, precise, and completely invisible to hegemony detection systems that were designed to identify energy weapons and conventional galactic armaments. Back on the command bridge of the Coalition flagship, General Kextar stared at his tactical displays in growing confusion. Hegemony forces were reporting casualties across multiple fronts, but Coalition sensors showed no human military activity whatsoever. "Where are the humans?" he demanded, his mandibles clicking with frustration. "Our sensors show them guarding the medical frigates, but hegemony ground forces are taking losses from unknown sources." Major Jae Sung, a human communications officer who had been monitoring radio chatter from the planet's surface, looked up from his improvised console. His equipment was cobbled together from various ship systems, allowing him to intercept communications that the Coalition's sophisticated arrays couldn't detect. "Sir," he said, his tone carrying the kind of professional calm that came from years of coordinating military operations in impossible situations. "The humans are everywhere." He paused, listening to fragmentary reports from confused hegemony, units describing attacks by invisible enemies using weapons that shouldn't exist, and nowhere the enemy expects. 3 weeks into what should have been a routine conquest, Admiral Vorthak of the hegemony stared at casualty reports that made no sense. His forces had lost 12% of their ground troops, 6 major installations, and countless equipment to an enemy that officially didn't exist. "Sir, we've identified the problem," announced his chief tactical officer, a cyborg whose brain processors had been working overtime analyzing the impossible situation. "The humans aren't fighting like any species in our database. They're using tactics that violate every principle of civilized warfare." Vorthak's 4 eyes focused on the holographic display, showing his remaining forces scattered across multiple worlds. Red markers indicated lost positions. Yellow showed compromised areas, and green represented what he hoped were still secure locations. The map looked like a disease was spreading through his perfect military machine. "Explain," he growled, his mandibles clicking with frustration. "They don't engage our superior firepower directly. Instead, they attack supply convoys using improvised explosives. They infiltrate secure positions through methods our sensors can't detect. They strike high-value targets from impossible locations, then disappear before we can respond. Sir, they're fighting like..." The cyborg paused, searching his databases for comparison. "Like vermin." What the hegemony officer couldn't understand was that humans had learned warfare in environments where being outgunned, outnumbered, and out-equipped was normal. Earth's conflicts had taught bitter lessons about survival when conventional victory was impossible. On the planet Kepler 442b, Sergeant Hai Jin crouched in the ruins of what had been a beautiful Coalition city. Around her, a mixed group of alien soldiers watched nervously as she demonstrated movement techniques learned in Earth's urban battlefields. "Watch how I move," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she flowed through broken concrete and twisted metal like water finding its path. "Don't think about the rubble as obstacles. Think of it as cover, concealment, and camouflage, all in one." A Coalition soldier from the peaceful Andorian system raised his primary hand. "Sergeant, this seems dishonorable. Shouldn't we face our enemies directly?" Hyojin paused, remembering cities on Earth where honor got good people killed and survival meant adapting to brutal realities. "Private, honor doesn't stop bullets or energy beams. Your enemy can't hit what they can't predict, and they can't predict movement that doesn't follow their tactical computers." She demonstrated the technique again, this time explaining how urban debris created blind spots in sensor coverage, how thermal signatures could be masked using environmental heat sources, and how the random nature of destroyed buildings made it impossible for targeting systems to predict human movement patterns. The alien soldiers began practicing, their movements awkward at first but gradually becoming more fluid. Species that had evolved in peaceful environments were learning to think like predators, to move like shadows, to strike like lightning, and vanish like mist. 50 kilometers away, Corporal Dongwu was conducting a different kind of training session. He sat in front of a captured hegemony communication array, his scarred fingers dancing across controls that had been designed for cybernetic enhancement rather than organic manipulation. Your enemy's strength becomes their weakness, he explained to a group of coalition intelligence officers. The hegemony uses quantum-encrypted networks for instant communication across their entire force. They think this makes them secure, but watch what happens when we turn their efficiency against them. His improvised equipment, built from salvaged components and human ingenuity, began injecting false data into the hegemony communication system. Enemy units started receiving contradictory orders, fake casualty reports, and warnings about threats that didn't exist. Information warfare, Dongwu continued, monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously. Make them afraid of their own shadows, uncertain of their own orders, suspicious of their own allies. A confused enemy makes more mistakes than a defeated one. Within hours, hegemony units were reporting phantom attacks, requesting reinforcements for non-existent threats and second-guessing orders from their own command structure. The perfect military machine was beginning to tear itself apart from within. On the medical frigate, Mercy's Wing, So Young had transformed the standard coalition hospital into something that would have made Earth's battlefield medics proud. The facility still treated wounded coalition personnel, but it had gained additional functions that galactic warfare had never required. Bring him in carefully, she directed 2 coalition medics carrying a wounded hegemony soldier. The enemy, Warrior, had been found unconscious near a destroyed supply depot, his cybernetic enhancements damaged, but his organic components salvageable. What made this unusual was that So Young intended to treat him. Sergeant, this is highly irregular, protested Dr. Keth Val, a coalition medical officer whose species had rigid concepts about treating enemies. Galactic warfare protocols specify that enemy casualties are the responsibility of their own forces. So Young looked up from her examination of the wounded soldier, her expression carrying the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of battlefield medicine. Doctor, this soldier has information about hegemony troop movements, supply schedules, and defensive positions. More importantly, when his friends find out we saved his life instead of leaving him to die, it changes how they think about us. She began working on the soldier's injuries with the same care she would show a coalition casualty. Back home, we learned that showing mercy to enemies often does more damage to their morale than killing them. Hard to maintain fighting spirit when the people you're supposed to hate keep proving they're more civilized than your own leaders. The hegemony soldier regained consciousness 3 hours later, his enhanced senses immediately analyzing his surroundings for threats. Instead, he found himself in a clean medical facility, his wounds professionally treated, with no restraints or interrogation equipment in sight. So Young approached his bedside carrying food and water. "You're safe here," she said in the hegemony's common language, which she'd learned from captured equipment manuals. "Your injuries were serious, but you'll recover completely." The soldier's tactical implants couldn't process this information. Enemy forces weren't supposed to provide medical care, comfort, or safety. His combat programming had no protocols for dealing with adversaries who showed mercy. "Why?" he asked, his voice carrying confusion that his cybernetic enhancements couldn't resolve. "Because that's what civilized people do," So Young replied, checking his vital signs. "Your commander sent you here to conquer and kill. We're showing you there's another way to live." Over the following weeks, similar scenes played out across multiple worlds. Coalition forces trained by human veterans began winning engagements they should have lost, using tactics that turned technological disadvantages into strategic advantages. Supply lines became vulnerable. Secure positions became traps, and superior firepower became useless against enemies who refused to engage conventionally. The hegemony's 1,000-year string of victories had been built on predictable opponents, who followed galactic warfare conventions. Now they faced an enemy that broke every rule, ignored every tradition, and fought with a creativity born from species that had spent millennia learning to survive against impossible odds. Admiral Vorthak received his final casualty report while staring out at the stars that had once represented inevitable conquest. His forces were requesting permission to withdraw from 7 different systems. His supply lines had become death traps, and his soldiers were beginning to question orders from commanders who clearly didn't understand the enemy they faced. For the first time in hegemony history, victory was no longer certain. The surrender request arrived through standard diplomatic channels, but its contents shattered 1,000 years of galactic history. Admiral Vorthak of the hegemony, conqueror of 47 star systems, was asking for terms to end a war he could no longer win. Commander Yuki read the message 3 times before believing it. "Unconditional cessation of hostilities," he murmured, his scaled fingers tracing the alien symbols on his display. "Withdrawal from all contested systems. Request for formal peace negotiations." He paused, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. "They're surrendering. The hegemony is actually surrendering." The news spread through coalition space like wildfire. Species that had cowered before hegemony might for centuries couldn't comprehend that their greatest enemy had been defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by a species that most had dismissed as primitive newcomers. 6 months later, the former battlefield of Kepler 442b had been transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. Where hegemony dropships had once landed to begin another conquest, construction crews from dozens of species worked together, building the Galactic Combat Training Institute. The facility sprawled across several continents, its training grounds designed to simulate every possible combat environment. There were urban warfare sections built from the ruins of destroyed cities, underground tunnel networks that mimicked insurgent hideouts, and obstacle courses that taught movement through hostile terrain. Most shocking to traditional galactic observers, there were also medical facilities where students learned to treat enemy casualties and interrogation centers, where mercy was considered as important as information gathering. Commander Yuki walked through the main administrative building, passing classrooms where species that had never known real conflict learned lessons written in human blood across Earth's endless wars. Through one window, he watched a Centaurian diplomat learning to construct improvised explosives from common household items. In another room, Andorian peacekeepers practiced urban camouflage techniques that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. "Commander," called a familiar voice. Jinho approached from the direction of the Tactical Planning Center, his weathered face showing satisfaction as he observed alien students practicing human warfare doctrine. "The graduation ceremony is about to begin. The first class is ready." Yuki fell into step beside the human captain, still struggling to reconcile Jinho's humble appearance with the strategic genius that had revolutionized galactic warfare. "How did you know?" he asked, a question that had haunted him for months. "How did you know your primitive weapons could defeat hegemony technology?" Jinho paused at a window overlooking the main training field. Below them, 200 alien graduates from 12 different species stood in formation, but not the rigid parade ground lines that had characterized galactic military tradition. Instead, they were arranged in loose, adaptive clusters that could respond to changing situations and unexpected threats. "Look at them," Jinho said, gesturing toward the assembled graduates. 6 months ago, these beings thought warfare was about honor, formal challenges, and technological superiority. Now they understand that real combat is about adaptation, survival, and the willingness to do whatever victory requires. He pointed to a group of former hegemony soldiers who had requested admission to the Institute after witnessing human tactics firsthand. "Even our former enemies want to learn from us. They realize that 1,000 years of easy victories had made them predictable, vulnerable to anyone willing to break their rules." Yuki watched as the graduation ceremony began. Instead of traditional military pageantry, the event focused on practical demonstrations. Students showed their instructors how to blend into civilian populations, how to turn everyday objects into weapons, how to gather intelligence from unwilling sources through patience rather than technology. Taemin stepped forward to address the graduates, his prosthetic arm catching sunlight as he gestured toward the assembled crowd. The mechanical limb had become famous throughout Coalition space, a symbol of human adaptability and refusal to surrender even when victory seemed impossible. 6 months ago, the galaxy thought it understood warfare, he began, his voice carrying easily across the training ground. Species fought with honor, followed established rules, and accepted defeat when outmatched by superior technology. You were civilized soldiers fighting civilized wars. He paused, his gaze sweeping across faces that belonged to species from across the galaxy. Former enemies sat beside coalition allies, all united by their shared experience learning to think like humans. But humans learned warfare differently. We've been fighting each other for our entire recorded history, not out of honor or territorial expansion, but for survival. Every technique we've taught you was paid for in blood by someone who faced impossible odds and refused to give up. The crowd listened with the intensity of students who had discovered that everything they thought they knew was wrong. These beings had learned to crawl through mud that ruined their pristine uniforms, to eat field rations that offended their refined palates, and to think like predators instead of civilized citizens. Boram stepped forward to present the graduation, certificates, documents that would make their holders the most sought-after military advisors in galactic history. What you've learned here isn't just tactics and techniques, she said. You've learned to survive when survival seems impossible, to adapt when your plans fail, and to find victory in situations where defeat appears certain. The ceremony concluded with a demonstration that would have horrified galactic observers 6 months earlier. Graduates worked together to assault a mock hegemony position using every technique they'd learned, from improvised explosives to psychological warfare to battlefield medicine. The exercise was chaotic, brutal, and completely effective. Later, as the newly graduated officers prepared to return to their home systems, Commander Yuki found himself standing beside Do-hyun on a hillside overlooking the institute. The gray-haired human veteran watched transport ships lifting off into the evening sky, carrying warriors trained in Earth's hard-learned lessons to every corner of the galaxy. What happens now? Yuki asked. You've taught the galaxy to fight, like humans. What comes next? Do-hyun was quiet for a long moment, his eyes tracking the departing vessels. Now we hope we never have to use these lessons again, he said finally. But if another threat emerges, if some new enemy thinks they can conquer the galaxy through superior technology and overwhelming force, they'll discover something that the hegemony learned too late. He turned to face Yuki, his weathered features serious. They'll learn that when you threaten species trained by Earth's veterans, you're not just fighting individual worlds or fleets. You're fighting an enemy that refuses to follow your rules, refuses to accept your definition of impossible, and refuses to surrender no matter how hopeless the situation appears. As the last transport disappeared into hyperspace, both beings understood that galactic warfare had changed forever. The age of predictable conflicts and honorable defeats was over. In its place had emerged something far more dangerous and far more effective, an entire galaxy trained to fight like humans. The hegemony's defeat had taught the universe a crucial lesson. Superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and perfect coordination meant nothing when facing an enemy willing to break every rule, adapt to every situation, and never, ever give up. The end.